All right, chapter 4 of the Gospel of Mark, beginning at the first verse. The decisions, choices we make along the way, right? They dramatically affect the outcome of our lives. And this is going to be one of those moments for you, for me, for all of us in this place. A moment of drama on what we do with what we hear next. Chapter 4 in the Gospel of Mark, beginning at the first verse. We're going to look at the first 9 verses. And verse 1 begins like this. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake while all the people were on the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching he said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked out the plants, so they did not bear grain. Still, other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So Jesus is again surrounded by a great crowd. We've seen this phenomenon in Mark's gospel. The crowds are growing in size and intensity. And now he finds himself out in a remote place along the water's edge, and the crowd is so great that he takes refuge out into a boat in the middle of the water so that the people can spread out along the shoreline. His voice, no doubt, carrying out over the water without a public address system, so he's found a way to create a homemade amphitheater out there where he can speak out his gospel message and the people sitting along the shorelines can hear. And Jesus is fulfilling the role of the sower in his own parable here at this point, isn't he? He says a sower goes out to sow seed and he begins flinging it out. And this is what Jesus is now doing himself. He's sitting in the boat on the water. The people are gathered along the shoreline. And the people who have gathered along the shoreline, no doubt, find themselves in all the different conditions that Jesus is going to share. Because those are the conditions of the human heart. These are the conditions that people walk into church with every single day. What I would suggest to you is that sometimes these conditions of our hearts are changing from one season to the next. There's seasons of our life where our heart is more open and in tune with the work of God, and there's other seasons when it's a little more closed off. It may even be possible that our heart on a daily basis is shifting through some of these different types of soil that Jesus is going to mention. From the time we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night, we experience a different level of openness to the word and grace of God falling on us. But I want you to pay attention as much as anything else, not just to the conditions of the human heart, but of the sower himself. Because in the end, this parable that Jesus tells is more about the sower than the soil, isn't it? It tells us more about the character and person of the sower of grace than it does about the receiver of the grace. I mean, we get informed about how people receive the word and grace of God, but how much more so are we told about the one who's giving it, the one who is sowing that word and sowing that grace out into our lives. Take a look at how Jesus begins this parable. He says, listen, a certain farmer goes out and he begins to sow seed. Some of the seed falls on the path. Some of the seed falls in rocky places. Some of the seed falls in the good soil. In other words, he paints a picture of a farmer sowing seed, and I can't put it in any other terms, a reckless fashion. The sower is sowing in some reckless ways. Now, I don't know how you plant your plants. I don't know how you sow your seeds. If you really want to be careful with your seed to make sure that it receives everything it needs to grow up into a healthy and strong plant, you typically will start small. You're going to put it in a little seed starter. You're going to put it into a nurturing environment with a heat lamp and with just the right conditions to make sure that every seed makes the most of its potential as it's coming up out of the ground. And then you begin to transplant it from one place to the next. Most people I know, especially in developing nations, where their seed distribution as farmers is given to them by the government, they get an allotment of seed that is proven to demonstrate the greatest yield, the greatest harvest. They are careful with their seeds because it is life and death. But what happens with the seed and the fruit that it produces is literally life and death for them and for their families. And here, Jesus paints a picture of a farmer who's got bags of seeds hanging off of his belt, and he's simply walking along and he's just throwing it out. Seeds for everyone, seeds for every soil, seeds as I walk along the path, seeds as I go along the rocky places, seeds as I go through the thin soils, seeds as I go through the good soils. This sower does not simply go to the place that he knows has the best soil and carefully plug each of his seeds into those places. But instead, he is recklessly sowing the seed everywhere he goes, on every condition of soil that he finds. This is good news for us in this place. Before we get to the part that challenges us to consider our response, first, let's celebrate the good news of the reckless nature of this sower of grace. The sower of grace is not looking at your heart and saying, they're hard-hearted. They've got some rocks inside. They're doing things that are going to prevent this seed from finding its space to grow. Instead, Jesus is simply saying, I'm going to give you my grace regardless of the condition of your heart. I'm going to sow my word and sow my grace in you, no matter where you've been or what you've done or how unlikely it may be that this seed will find root in your heart. I'm still going to give it to you. I'm not going to be deciding who gets grace and who doesn't. I'm simply going to sow my grace to all of you. How about that? How about that character of who God is? He recklessly sows his grace in people who decidedly do not deserve it and who may or may not even receive it. And still, he sows it, he sows it, he sows it, and he sows it. This tells us something about the sower. This tells us something about Jesus himself, about the very character and nature of God. Ours is a grace-filled God who wants to put his word into your heart and sow his grace into your life. So let's start there and let's hold on to that as we progress through this teaching from Jesus on the side of the lake. Remember who God is and what he's doing for you. And Jesus says, look, as this sower is sowing the seed, some of it is going to fall along the path, and the birds are going to come and eat it up. Now, Jesus is going to unpack this parable for his disciples. If you continue reading here in chapter 4 of Mark's gospel, Jesus is actually going to explain exactly what he meant by each of these parables and each of these types of soils and each of the consequences that come about to the disciples. So we have a window into his mind. We don't have to imagine what he was thinking. He tells us exactly what he means. And so it opens up the opportunity for us to begin to identify with these types of soils and how these things happen in our lives so that we have an opportunity to present our hearts perhaps differently than they originally offer themselves when that seed of grace falls. So Jesus says some of it falls on the path. And when it falls on the road, the ground is beaten down, it's trampled, it's hard, and so the seed just sits on top. And because it's sitting on top, it's easy prey for the birds. They can see the seed. It's not nestled among the loose, good soil. It's not even in the rocks and the dirt, but it's just right there on the hard path. And so it's the easiest pickings of all for the birds, and they come and they just snatch it up. What Jesus says is this type of soil refers to people who their hearts are so hard to the person and grace of God that even though the seed does get sown on them, the devil is able to come and snatch it away before they have a chance to really even analyze it. This is the person who has given the enemy reign in their life, given them space in their heart to come and dictate the terms of how they maneuver, how they speak, how they interact with others. These are people whose hearts have become so hardened to the Lord that when the seed falls, it's easy for the devil to see an act of grace headed their way and just come and snap it up before it can do any good in their lives. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever experienced a season like that or even a moment like that in your life? When you're feeling so low or down, when you're feeling such great self-pity or woe is me so hard that the grace of God lands in your life and you can't even see it because you can only see yourself in that moment. You can only see your pain in that time. You can only see your hurt or your anger or your grief or your bitterness. And the grace of God that is falling on you in those hard moments is immediately being snatched away by the devil. He's just stealing it because he knows if it begins to find even the smallest crack or crevice, it might explode into hope and healing in your life in such a way as you begin to then close the door on him. Anybody ever gone through something like that? Been de-churched because of pain, because the world events have overtaken you and you're just convinced that God's no longer in the world because of the pain and the heartbreak that you see out and around you, that you become so convinced that there can't be anything good other than what I make for myself. I know there are those in this place who have experienced that because, of course, I know you and I've heard your stories. Jesus says, in those moments when our hearts are just hard and compacted, it's not that the grace is not still falling on us. It is. It's just that the devil's snatching it away before we can even realize it. He goes on from there and he says, now some of it falls on rocky places where it doesn't have much soil, and it springs up quickly because the soil is shallow. But when the sun comes up, the plants are scorched and they wither because they have no roots. And what he describes to the disciple of this condition of the human heart is this. He says, the seed sown on that rocky soil, people get really excited about it. They have like an emotional conversion or they have like an ecstatic experience and they're like, yay, this is everything. And then they come back to hard reality really quickly. And when they come back into hard reality really quickly, their seed, that seed of grace just disappears because the sun fries it. Maybe the most common experience of this that I've seen in ministry over the last 20 years is particularly among kids who go to camp, right? Kids, they're like, struggling with life. Maybe they're the hard place and rocky soil. They go to camp and it's like they're separated from the world. Their phone stops dinging because they're out in a place where they can focus fully on the Lord, and their parents aren't yelling at them, and their friends who have been talking, gossiping about them are left behind. Kids get into that place and they have this heartwarming experience, and everyone there is just into it, and we're singing, and we're praising the Lord, and we're coming down, we're pouring out our tears on the altar, and then they come home, and it turns out that while they were away and receiving that grace and experiencing that initial change, nothing in the world that they left has changed. Their parents are still going through a divorce, and their friend is still out there betraying them. And their girlfriend, their boyfriend is still not reciprocating the expression of love that they're looking for. And it's like they confront this reality that they left, and they thought the grace that they began to receive would change everything around them. And when it doesn't, that little plant burns up. That little kernel of faith, it just evaporates and burns up because the roots weren't really deep enough yet. And it's not just kids, of course, but we as adults experience the same thing. It's not quite so dramatic in the terms of, 1 week at camp and then coming back home and crashing down again at the first invitation to a party, the first, opportunity to run out with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. It's not quite so dramatic, but I know that all of us have gone through those similar kinds of seasons where we see God at work moving in such profound ways that we are convinced that nothing will ever be wrong again, and then boom, we lose our job. Our kid makes a horrible decision. Our spouse gets a terminal diagnosis. And it's like, forget it. All that came before it just burned up, it's sizzled, it's gone. And so I think we can all identify with how that works and how it happens. And what Jesus says is, that is like a seed that falls on a rocky place. Have you ever seen like a little tiny plant growing in a place where it shouldn't, like between the cracks of a sidewalk? That's what it's talking about. It shouldn't grow there, but even if it does, it's not going to grow into a mighty oak. It's going to get burned up because there's no way for it to have as much as it needs in that shallow place to thrive and to survive. I'll just say it this way. If your entire Christian identity is your social media presence, I post lovely pics of me at church and doing these things, but there's no study and prayer and community and service behind any of that. It's maybe on the thin soil, and something is probably going to come and overwhelm you. He says, now some of the soil falls among thorns and thistles, and it just never even has a chance. Even if it finds good soil, the soil's already being consumed by thorns and thistles. And he explains this is the person who receives that word, receives that grace, but they are so worried about the things of the world, it gets choked out. This is a hard reality, but you can't simultaneously cultivate the grace and word of God in the good soil and worries and concerns about your physical life. Jesus puts it pretty bluntly in other places and says you can't serve God and money. If you try to do both, you'll lose God. I mean, this is essentially what Jesus is saying. And this is what he's communicating to people in this parable. He says, if you're constantly worried about the stress of providing your daily bread, if you don't trust the Lord for all that if you don't believe that he knows what your every need really is and will move to provide it to your good, if you think you have to be in control of making every decision in your life and figuring it all out for yourself, you will be so consumed with those worries that you won't leave room for God to do what he wants to do. To make you into an Olympic breakdancer. Right? You have to leave room in your heart for the Lord's work to be done without choking it out by trying to control what you want and think you need for your life. It sounds easy to do, but there are times when it's extraordinarily difficult. Right? You know, I'm talking about when the Lord presses on you to do something that doesn't make any sense at all in the moment you find yourself in. Like, that does not make any sense, Lord, for me to make this choice. It doesn't equate, it doesn't compute. There's no way that that could then work out for me, for my family, for the world around me. And the Lord still presses on you about it, and you have to make a choice. Do I step to what the Lord is calling, or do I not step to what the Lord is calling? And I'll just be honest, my experience has been, I suspect it's like this for many of you, it's not until months, even years later, when you look back in hindsight, that you can see, perhaps, what God was doing. Why He called on you to surrender your breakdancing career and to pursue something of perhaps even greater eternal significance. It may not make sense at the time, but you sense the Lord pressing you towards faithfulness in a calling, and you choose whether you will step out to follow it or not. And then, of course, He says, there are those seeds that fall on the good soil. I mean, the well-plowed, fertilized soil, the soil that's been tended and cared for, the soil that has been cultivated and designed to receive the seed, to push down strong roots, and to produce a great crop. And then Jesus goes even a step beyond that. Because what Jesus describes about the seed in that soil is not the natural result of a good seed on good soil. He describes the supernatural result of a good seed on good soil that receives the blessing of God. That's the secret in the sauce. That He's able to say that single seed can then produce a result that's 30, 60, even 100 times what it otherwise would. Without the blessing of God, it's going to produce as it should, according to the laws of nature. But if the seed has the blessing of God on it, then it will produce even beyond what you would suspect or imagine or think is really possible. And so it's that kind of soil is the person who receives the Word of God, the grace of Christ, and they let it just bury inside of them to the innermost places, where it begins to define not just the outward expression of their life and faith, but it begins to transform them from the inside out. That begins to steadily remove sin itself from their heart, from their mind, from their thinking. It begins a sanctifying work inside of them that explodes upward and outward, knowing that the roots down below can bear the weight of fruit that is 30, 60, or 100 times what the plant should be able to hold. This is Jesus' invitation to us and to the people sitting on the shoreline. Though He doesn't say it in explicit form, it's understood. You know, Jesus says, let those with ears hear. Let those who can hear, hear. Is He not saying it's up to you? Is that not the message He's offering about what the return of the Word and grace of God is going to be in your life? He says, here's what's up to me. I'm giving you my grace. I'm putting my Word in your heart. I'm putting my grace in your heart. That's what's up to me, and here's what I've decided. I'm putting it in your heart. If it's hard, if it's rocky, if it's thorns and thistly, if it's good soil, I'm giving you my grace because that's what's up to me. But listen closely. What kind of soil you are is up to you. Will you receive this word? Will you receive this grace? Will you give it quarter in your heart and in your mind? Will you let it override your worries, your doubts, anxieties? Will you let it guide you through the hardships that life inevitably is going to throw your way? Will you trust the roots of this gospel in your life to sustain you and to hold you? Will you patiently wait for the flowering of fruit to begin? Can you trust me? This is really what Jesus is inviting the people on the shoreline to listen and to do. And this is good news, friends, because it reminds us that the condition of our heart is not set in stone. That your eternal life is not set with no ability to do anything about. That the people that you love, that you care about, who are living hard-hearted, thorny and thistle and rocky lives, are not beyond the reach of God and His grace. That there is always hope for that seed to find soil that begins to get cultivated and tilled and nurtured so that it might grow. I want to take just a few minutes here to talk about how we do that, friends. First and foremost, sometimes you need to run a plow through the soil of your heart. There's a difference between a plow and a harrow, you know? A harrow is like a rake. You just kind of like rake the top. A plow is going to cut deep, and it's going to honestly destroy the structure of the soil underneath. It's going to explode it. And the reason why you run the plow is to loosen up everything, to make room for something to come in. If there's no room in the soil, there's no room for the seed, there's no room for the roots, the water's just going to rush off in the other direction. And so sometimes we have to plow it out. That may be you. You may be in a place where you're like, oh, Lord, plow my heart. Now, that's a dangerous prayer. I'm just going to put it out to you right now. So I commend it to you, but I caution you with it. Lord, plow my heart. It may call for you to dislodge some things that is particularly uncomfortable for you. But when we plow that ground, the rocks begin to pop up to the surface, and we can collect them and toss them to the side. And when we plow that, it tears up the roots of the thorns and the thistles. It can destroy a path. It's like a jackhammer cutting through the sidewalk. So if you're in a place where your heart is hard to the Spirit of God, to the Word of truth, and to the grace of Jesus Christ, invite God to run a plow right through there, to turn up the rocks, cast them to the side, to break that ground and release the thorns and thistles so that they can just be collected and thrown into the fire and burned, because that's what you do with thorns and thistles. You throw them into the fire because they are not good for anything. Worry, stress, anxiety, doubts, they are all things that we experience, but they just scratch at you and at your ankles, and they choke out the grace of God. And the only thing that's really good for them is to throw them in the fire and burn them up. Bye. Doesn't that sound good? I had a mentor in Corpus Christi. He was a math and science teacher at Del Mar Community College down there for years and years. He was one of the most singular individuals I've ever known. One time, they brought him a computer to use, and he said no, and they put it on his desk, and he put it in the hall. They're like, this will make you work faster and better. And he was like, why would I want to work faster? I'm already working better. And then they did these mandatory courses for all the professors, and one of them was on stress management. And they came and they said, Gaylord, all the professors are required to take this stress management course because we're worried about burnout, and so we need you to take it. And he said, I'm not going to take it. And they said, why not? He said, I don't have any stress. Why would I want to learn how to manage it? Like, what do you mean you don't have any stress? She's like, well, I don't have that computer that you tried to give me. I teach my students. I'm faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ. And I don't worry about the rest. Is one of the most beloved professors to ever work there, I guarantee you. Anyway, interesting guy. That's why we throw the thorns and thistles into the fire. I don't want to cultivate them. Oh, let's trim that thorn bush into a nice hedge. That seems like a great idea. No. Why would you want to manage thorns and thistles? Why would you want to learn to cultivate and quietly control them and keep them on the perimeter of your life? How about just rip them out and throw them away altogether? That's what Jesus invites us to do when he invites us to plow our hearts. Plow your heart. Plow your heart. Now, if you are a person who already has a heart that's been plowed open, that you know that seed of grace and gospel, I hope this is most of you here in this place. It is so important that you do ongoing soil conservation. You have to continue to turn it over, to fertilize it, to water it, to tend it. And those things are things like coming to worship. This is part of the good soil, is being in the experience of corporate worship together. This is where the soil is kind of turned over and churned a little bit, where it becomes healthy. Going into Sunday school and Bible studies and small groups, accountability groups. This is where the soil keeps getting turned over, where it gets fertilized with the goodness of God. And you have to do those things, listen, out of season. Not just when you're wanting to grow some fruit. You have to do it out of season, before the planting, much less before the harvest. And so that means when everything is going well, you have to keep cultivating the soil. And when things aren't going well, you have to keep cultivating the soil. And when everything is horrible, you have to keep cultivating the soil. And what Jesus says is, if you have ears to hear, hear me. Receive the word of grace that is coming to you now. Let it take root and let it grow. And listen to this. If you do, you won't get the result that the rest of the world gets by their own strength and power. You will get a supernatural result of fruit. Supernatural. 30, 60, 100 times what everybody else that does it on their own strength and power gets. Because it is the Spirit of God working to bring His purpose in your life about. God has more for you than you could possibly imagine. His promise for you is greater, Scripture says, than all you could ask or imagine. That's that divine multiplication that He wants to work in the faithful, well-tended heart. Jesus stands on the shoreline in His day, and He stands here today. And He says to the people, look, this is who I am, the sower of grace. I'm going to give it to each of you, every one of you. No one will escape the grace of God, because that's who He is. What you do with that seed, how you care for it and tend it, defend it, and hold on to it, that is what will make all the difference. And so, church, I encourage you, I exhort you, and I plead with you. Hold on to that seed of grace, the word of truth that Christ has sown into you. Defend it and cultivate it and nurture it. And I promise you, as it grows and multiplies, you will never be the same again.